So those are early life experiences that lead to vulnerabilities. We then have presenting problems. So what's actually going on for the person right now that's problematic. Precipitating factors, what triggers those presenting problems. Perpetuating factors are what maintains those problems once they've started and keeps them from happening. And keeps them happening, not from happening, keeps them going. And then we've got the protective factors, which you hope keep someone safe and can help to reduce the presenting problems and help to reduce the precipitating problems and hope to reduce the perpetuating factors. So I think this is pretty good for an initial impression. So we're going to try something quite different today, something that I've never done before on the channel. We're going to try and do Powder's psychological formulation. So I wasn't going to do a video like this. My plan was to watch all 3 episodes of the arc and then do a psychological summary of the whole arc. And I'm still going to do that. But what I wanted to do after this first episode was get my initial thoughts and understanding out there. So you can see where I am now. You can see my initial impression of what's going on in my mind, and you'll be able to see how that might change over time as the characters develop. I thought that might be quite fun. So I haven't really planned what I'm going to say in this. I have a few ideas, but I wanted this to come out how a relatively real formulation would go. So usually this wouldn't be just me. There'd be a few of us who knew the person or were working with the person we were formulating. And it's usually done a bit like House does this. I don't know if you've ever seen House, the TV series, where he has a whiteboard, he stands up in front of everyone, and everyone throws out ideas. And House doesn't really ever, at that point, pretend to have the answers. He doesn't pretend to know anything. He's exploring, he's putting ideas on the table, he's exploring them and discussing them with other people. So what's a formulation, I hear you ask? Well, to put it in very simple terms, it's a way of understanding someone's difficulties, and it helps us focus on the why they are happening rather than just the what is happening. So we try to get an understanding rather than just a description of what. This then helps to inform strategies for treatment and where we can support someone. And we're going to do this today using a system called the 5 Ps, which is a really widely used framework, which is used in clinical and social settings. This will make more sense as we go along. I don't want to explain too much about the how we're going to do this. I just want to get into it, show you, and then you'll understand as we go through it. So let's see how we get on with this. So what I thought would be the best way to do this would be to focus on one character, because then if we do it with one character, we've got the skill set then to do it with others. And you can apply this to kind of anyone, really. This is a generic framework that can be used for any person with any behavior. So let's think about Powder. I think that's going to give us a good starting place. It's easier to do this with just one person. And you'll see through this process that this can be applied to any of the characters. And there's probably some overlap actually between Vi and Powder. If you like this, then we can do this with lots of characters as we go on. And the cool thing about formulation is a lot of people will say, Stu, how can you formulate someone after one episode? And that's a really, really valid question. And my answer to that is you can start formulating immediately. The idea of a formulation is it's dynamic. It changes over time as we get more information. It changes over time as the person does different things. It gets fed into the formulation. So it's not like a static understanding from one snapshot in time. It develops over time. So what that means is we can start putting information into it straight away. We can start getting that initial understanding and our thoughts, and then we adapt it as we move along. So something like a TV series, that could be really cool, because as I watch more and more of the show, we can update this formulation and get a better understanding of perhaps what's going on and the reasons why. So I'm really excited to give this a go. This was something I wanted to do really with Blurry Face and 21 Pilots, but no one seemed particularly interested in it. Right, so let's get Powder. In fact, let's get a picture of Powder. There she is. Right, let's whack her up here. We're going to need a bit of space for this. So we're doing the 5 Ps. The first P we're going to look at is predisposing. This seems to be working. So we're going to start with the first P, which is predisposing. So what in the early years leads to vulnerability to current difficulties? So this could be things like genetics, it could be culture, it could be learning, it could be experiences. There's a wide range of things for us to consider here. Okay, we don't want to go too deep with this at the moment because it's just an initial formulation which we'll build on over time, and we could talk about each point all day. We haven't got time for that. So what are the main predisposing factors that we can consider? Well, one thing that comes to mind, and I can try to pull up some screenshots from the episode to back some of these points up, is a deprivation of age appropriate opportunities. So we have a deprivation of appropriate age opportunities. I'm hoping that pen isn't too thick, but I'm hoping it'll be easier to read on people's smaller screens. So usually we would see early years as a time of learning, as a time of fun and play and being creative and trying new things, where all of these things are centered around this idea of a safe base of having a nurturing parent or a carer to return to when things go wrong. So a toddler falls over, hurts themselves, they get up, they can return to the parent or the carer, who then co-regulates and soothes. Now, something I'm aware of is that we don't know what Powder's life was like with Mum and before this. I don't know if it was a full-out war or a battle or one-off event. But the first time that I've been introduced to Powder's mum is the death of the mum. So I don't know anything before that. There didn't seem to be any mention of dad or any sign of dad. So it looks like there's some kind of parental separation. So that's something to consider when we're thinking about how Powder might be viewing her first introduction to relationships and people staying together. But we're not sure, and I know this is an assumption, we're going to have to make some of this, but we can update it as we get more information. We're not sure whether that parental separation came through choice, as in they decided to leave each other and separate, or whether it happened as a result of death. So maybe dad died before mum and was no longer around. We don't know. But potentially we've got a single mother raising 2 girls in what looks like a very arduous environment. And we also get this idea, I said arduous environment then, so we get this idea that there's a lot of poverty and oppression. And we see that throughout the episode. We see after, I think it was the bridge scene, there's that palace or whatever building it was off in the distance up high. So we see there's probably some disparity there in terms of living conditions for people. And that was above all the smog and smoke and clouds. And we see parts where there are enforcers wearing masks because it looks as if the air is unhealthy. Now, there could be some play with this. It could be the air is unhealthy. It could be the enforcers just perceive it is unhealthy, or perhaps the enforcers perceive it as getting rid of the stench of the slums for them. maybe they've been told and trained and educated that down there in the slums, it's unhealthy. So you best put your mask on so you don't catch anything. Just to strengthen that divide. Maybe so they're not as empathetic towards those people. Maybe it really is unhealthy because there's very little money and there's no mechanism to actually keep things clean. Or maybe there's no mechanism for people to seek medical help when they need it. So so far we've got predisposing, we've got deprivation of appropriate age opportunities, we've got parental separation, we've got poverty and oppression, we've got the obvious here, the exposure to trauma. The death of mum. And although mum was obviously a really important person, there was likely way more deaths than that she might have seen prior to seeing mum, although she had her eyes covered with her hand. She would have sneaked a look. She probably would have saw stuff before they decided that she was going to put her hand up. So she would have been aware. She would have been exposed to far more death than just her mum. And at the time of that experience, we see her reaction of seeing her mum. But what's really interesting is her reaction seems more directed towards Vi than mum. And I think this could be for several reasons. Maybe she wasn't that close to her mum, and Vi had taken more of a caring role, so she feels closer to her. Maybe Powder doesn't know how to process what she's seeing, and she's looking to Vi to see how Vi is processing it, to see how someone older and more mature processes what they're looking at. And there's also this idea that if a caregiver response to a situation is that they get dysregulated, and Vi gets quite dysregulated, rightly so, because it's horrific. So the carer gets dysregulated and the child sees that. The child then dampens their own response in order to try and regulate the caregiver. So they essentially put the needs of their caregiver before their own. And this later leads to a pattern of putting others' needs before yours and not showing emotion well. Because it's important for you as a child to keep the carer regulated so they can then attend to your needs. So we've got deprivation of appropriate age opportunities, parental separation, poverty and oppression, and exposure to trauma. Exposure to trauma. There's the, what else do we have? We've got ongoing fights and threats to her safety. But I think that probably fits in one of the later parts of the framework called perpetuating factors. And same with the fact that she appears to be growing up in a bar. I mean, that could go here, depending on how long she's been there for. In predisposing, I'd like to think what her earlier years were like before the bar, in terms of that environment and what her home life was like. Again, poverty, oppression. We don't know about basic needs. They might not have been being met. We don't know about food intake, diet, sleep, those kind of things. But she's living in a bar. We don't know what that has led to her being exposed to. We talked about parentification in my reaction, and something that quite often comes with I can't say it now. Parentification is this idea of adultification. And that's where, despite her age, she is seen as less vulnerable than she really is. But again, I think that could fit later on in our framework. So what else is there? What have I missed off here? There's probably loads I'm missing, but I don't want this to be mega long. And whilst we're thinking about all of this, we're thinking about how do all of these things, how do all of them impact how she sees the world, other people, and herself. This is really important. So Generally speaking, does she see the world as dangerous? Or does she see it as generally a safe place, a safe world where bad things do happen? Because there's a difference. Can people be trusted? Will people let me down? Do they always reject me? Or can I build strong, lasting relationships with others? What about myself? Do I know who I am? Do I know what's important to me? Do I know how I want to be in the world? Or do I have absolutely no sense of that and I'm just drifting from group to group? Or am I spending all my time alone because I don't fit in anywhere else? We then have, and I think this is interesting where this fits in. I think part of this fits in with predisposing, and part of it probably fits in with the maintaining part later on. But we have to consider this. We have to consider this exposure to trauma. We have to consider whether this is probably going to get a little bit messy, whether there's PTSD, although that wouldn't strictly be in the predisposing section. But the argument I'm going to make is there PTSD or is there developmental trauma? You can also have both. So PTSD, clinical diagnosis, developmental trauma, not diagnosis. This is more of a lens. PTSD, hypervigilance, avoidance, intrusive thoughts or memories or images. There's intrusive stuff connected with the trauma. So the first question I think I'd be asking is there any evidence of this? So do we have any evidence of hypervigilance? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we do. She doesn't look like she's always on edge all of the time to me. She looks quite comfortable when she's around some of her friends. When she was out, walking back before they got confronted, she looked mostly okay. She didn't look like she was particularly on edge all of the time. So maybe sometimes, but not all of the time. So there might be some evidence of hypervigilance. So I'm going to say limited evidence of hypervigilance. That's not to say that she doesn't have any. That's just specifically in terms of what we've seen. And I watched the episode yesterday, so my memory might be a bit rusty with this. But we can update this. Avoidance. Is there any evidence of avoidance? I don't think there is. I haven't seen much. Not really. Not yet, anyway. She's going out with her friends. She's doing things that they're asking her to do. Although some of the activities might be quite questionable, she's not avoiding them. She doesn't seem to be avoiding any specific place. I don't know yet. It'll be interesting to see if she's been back to the bridge, whether she visits the bridge at some point, or whether she's actively avoiding that, whether she takes different routes to avoid it, whether she just doesn't need to go there. But I haven't seen any specific evidence of avoidance. And again, with intrusive thoughts, haven't really seen any evidence of this either. There was that one scene where her friends were fighting and she was involved, and she kind of backed against a wall and she kind of sunk down. Would you say was she having an intrusive kind of memory or image there of previous fights or the war, seeing her mum dead? Potentially, she could be. Are they intrusive, or are they coming about because she's being reminded of it? And if that's the case, how real does it feel to her at the time? Because the thing about intrusive memories and what we're kind of looking for is this flavor of it feeling real, feeling the same emotion, feeling the same bodily symptoms. but she was in a situation where she might feel those things anyway because they were literally under attack. So it's kind of hard to pick apart at that point. But what we did see was she sunk down. It looked like she was trying to process what was going on, seeing her friends fighting. And then she managed to get herself back up and run off. So she managed to, her body went into fight or flight and she flew, which seems to be an appropriate response. So PTSD, you could question complex PTSD. So complex PTSD adds some other components. It adds problems with relationships. It adds difficulties with affect. It's a fancy word for emotion, regulation. And it adds guilt and shame. Like it's my fault it happened. But the thing is, you can't, if you don't have PTSD, you can't have complex PTSD, because the first point of complex PTSD is that you have PTSD. In the ICD-11, the DSM-5, most used in America, doesn't even have the diagnosis of complex PTSD. It's all lumped into PTSD. So this then brings our attention to this idea of developmental trauma. Now I've got a video on my trauma channel about developmental trauma, and it goes through the 7 domains and how developmental trauma impacts people. If you want a more in-depth discussion, go and check that video out. But what we can do is put a little picture of Alexandra Cook's work. So Alexandra Cook and Bessel van der Kolk put out this paper a little while ago called Complex Trauma in Children and Adolescents. And this is where the term complex trauma gets a bit tricky, because this predates the actual diagnosis of complex trauma. So it doesn't mean complex trauma in the diagnostic sense. This is more developmental trauma now. And they put together this really cool table. Right, so my recording software didn't like me rotating my iPad, so I've just loaded it back up. What we were looking at was, so if I make this so you can see it. So this is a table that shows the domains of impairment in children exposed to complex trauma. So we can see straight away that there's problems with attachment. And this gives us some examples of what that looks like. So we've got problems with boundaries, distrust, social isolation, interpersonal difficulties, difficulty attuning to how other people feel, and difficulty with perspective taking, which is all of these things. We have difficulty with biology, so that's kind of physical stuff. You can see what goes on here. I haven't seen much evidence of this so far. In attachment, I think we've seen a bit of distrust and suspiciousness, maybe in terms of how she sees other people talking about her, but that's actually experience that she's had. She's not making that up. Are there some interpersonal difficulties there, potentially? I've not seen much social isolation. I've not seen how she's attuned to other people's emotional states yet. I'm not really sure about perspective taking. Then we have affect regulation. This is a biggie. And I talked about this in my reaction because I remember talking about co-regulation and the importance of that and being able to articulate what you're feeling. This is a biggie when it comes to developmental trauma. So we have difficulty with emotional self-regulation, difficulty labeling and experiencing those emotions once they've come up, problems knowing and describing the internal state. That's called interoception. So what is your body doing when it feels a certain way? And be able to understand and make that connection. So when I'm angry, I know my heartbeat has increased, and I know my breathing's increased, and I might get a bit sweaty. But interestingly, that's also quite similar to when I feel scared, and it's also quite similar to when I feel anxious. So I need to be able to understand what my body is doing and why. So understanding the fight and flight response, but also being able to connect that with the situation I'm in, and then connecting that with the appropriate emotion. So my body's feeling either scared, anxious, or frightened, or angry. I'm not sure what emotion that is in. Oh, I'm in this particular situation. Someone is threatening me with a weapon. I'm feeling scared. That seems an appropriate reaction. So making those links. We then have disassociation or dissociation. We haven't seen much of that yet, I don't think. in terms of Powder's reactions. Maybe a little bit when she was sinking down the wall, that part we just spoke about when her friends were being attacked. You might have seen a little bit there, but she soon came back out of it, returned to the present, and managed to leg it. So we see here distinct alterations in states of consciousness. So that's the idea of not being in the present anymore and being stuck back in the past of a memory. Amnesia, so not remembering things. We've got these ideas of depersonalization, derealization, which are actually disorders in their own right. You can see the rest here. On the far end of the spectrum, we've got dissociative identity disorder, which are actually properly distinct personalities within a body. On the milder end of dissociation is like what you would consider quite normal. So if you get caught up in a good book and someone's saying your name, Stu, can you come and put the kettle on? And I'm just enjoying my book. I'm so engrossed in it. I'm out of the present moment in terms of my awareness, but I'm really focused on something right in front of me. We then have behavioral stuff. So you can see aggression towards others. Have we seen much of that? Have we seen much of her aggression? She says something like, I'm not a fighter.
I'm not a fighter.
Self-destructive behavior. We've seen any self-harm in there? I'm not sure. Poor modulation of impulses. Has she done anything that she wanted to do impulsively and couldn't stop herself? Maybe taking the blue bombs. Although I think there was a reason that she took them, because they were there looking for stuff. Eating disorders. I'm not sure. I don't think I've seen any of that. Sleep. I'm not sure about her sleep. Substances. I've not seen any use of substances. Excessive compliance. That's an interesting one. So that's always doing things that people want you to do, despite you not really wanting to do it. You just want to be compliant with them. Oppositional behavior. Difficulty understanding and complying with rules. Yeah, potentially. I mean, she's kind of law breaking, I'm guessing. Reenactment of trauma in behavioral play. Reenactment is a massive, really complicated subject, and I have a whole video dedicated to that on my trauma channel called Why Do People Reenact the Trauma? Go and check that out. That video did quite well. People seem to like it. Then we've got difficulties with cognition. So that's like attention and executive functioning. So decision making, problem solving, those kind of things. I haven't seen much of that. I think we'll probably, when we go into the other P's, the protective factors, we'll see how actually she's quite good at that stuff. Let's not spend too long on this. You can read these. You can pause it and read it. And then this one's really important as well when it comes to developmental trauma, this idea of self-concept and how you see yourself in the world and with others. So a lack of continuous, predictable sense of self. I see that all the time in my practice. Poor sense of separateness. Maybe not so much with her. That's when you are so connected with another person that you almost feel like you're one person. Body image, not so much. Low self-esteem, shame and guilt. So these are the signs. These are what we would look for in developmental trauma. This has gone red because it thinks I'm trying to do a mass equation. So keep that in mind as we go through this and we see more of Powder. Right, so that's only one P. That's the first P. I realised I've actually been talking for half an hour just on that point, so I'm gonna massively edit this down for you guys so you can so you don't get too bored. So where did we get up to? So we were doing predisposing. So that is all of our predisposing stuff there. Fine. The next P we've got, so I'm going to get this roughly in line. Let's just do it here. Is protective factors. Protective factors. This is our second P. They're exploring. Don't worry, the predisposing is probably the longest part. So protective factors, well, this is pretty self-explanatory. This is what protects her and prevents her difficulties from worsening. So what do we have? What is protective for her? Well, she's quite creative. She's intelligent. What else? She's quite practical. And we know this because we see her making those little bombs that she made. And it's nice to see that she also, is it nice to see? It's not nice to see a child making bombs, I guess. But she gives them those cute names so you can see the child side of her coming through.
What are you calling this one?
Whisker.
So at heart, she's still a child, but she's grown up so quickly, partly because of adultification. and obviously the environment that she's in. We have the fact that she is physically fit and she looks relatively healthy. Like we can't see her insides in terms of what's going on there, but she looks healthy. She's fit. We see her doing all sorts of exercise. We see her running. We see her jumping over rooftops. So yeah, she seems to have a relatively safe base to return to, which I talked about in the reaction with Vanda and the actual physical environment. It's a pub. It's a bar. Questionable whether it is protective or not. It could also be re-traumatizing for her, depending on what she's been exposed to there. But for now, let's call it a protective factor because that's where she goes. That's clearly where she feels the most settled or the most content. And talking about that, she has Vi and Vanda. So she's got older people she can turn to when she needs to. She seems quite brave and courageous. Maybe that's a good word here for her. She seems brave and courageous. She seems up for trying anything with her friends. But at the same time, we need to be cautious that that doesn't shift into that excessive compliance that we talked about earlier. And then it also leaves her quite vulnerable because of her age and her size, I guess, especially given the circumstances that they're in and the fact that, people are trying to mug them as they're walking through the streets. I think we'll leave it there for protective factors. We've then got presenting problems. So presenting problems, this can be internal problems. So thoughts, memories, feelings, emotions, images in the head. I'm not sure if I said that. Or it could be external problems, so external to the person, so things within the situation or the environment. And this is probably the trickiest with a TV show, especially this early on. If she was a real person and we had access to her, we could speak to her, we could explore what she is currently struggling with, either externally or internally, and then link that back to the other ports to explore stuff and come up with a plan to help her meet her needs, to help her meet her values, however she's that. Usually someone would have an idea of this when they come into therapy or they seek help. There would be an idea of why they were doing that, and this is where that would fit in. We don't have a real powder in real life to talk to and figure out what she actually wants help with, if anything. But let's perhaps make some assumptions now, and this may change as time goes on. Maybe her problematic behaviors will become more apparent in the rest of the arc. So if we think about those developmental trauma domains, the 7 domains, then she probably has a bit of a shaky sense of self and how she fits in. So I'm just going to put sense of self here for now. Shaky. I mean, that's blatantly not a clinical term. We're just calling it. I think you know what I mean. I don't like using clinical terms all the time. I try to use common language, but the problem with common language is everyone uses it differently. So it tends to actually lose its meaning, where a clinical definition has a clinical definition that most people know, well, not the client as such, but let's just call it a shaky sense of self. What else have we potentially got? She's the youngest. She's the smallest. There's a few of the groups saying that because of that, she's not good enough. She's a bit of a liability. So again, they're saying she's small, she gets in the way, she screws things up. She's a liability. That will reinforce this sense of this poor sense of self, perhaps a shaky sense of self, as we've called it. Despite this stuff, she seems to hold her own, in my opinion, all things considered. Does she hold her own? Does she see this as a problem? I don't know. I'm just assuming here. I'm just trying to find something to put here. Does she see this as a problem? I think she probably does, because I think she had a bit of a discussion about this, and I can't remember the exact discussion with Vi, but I think it revolved around her fitting in. So there's that. Something else we have to bear in mind that's just popped into my head is we've got to consider with this, is this a result of trauma? Or is this normal adolescent, that's not how you spell adolescent, teenage development? Because loads of teenagers grow up with a bit of a shaky sense of self. And loads of teenagers feel like they don't fit in, and it takes them a while to find their tribe as such. Yeah. So what's normal? And what's a developmental phase that they're going through that it could be problematic now, but isn't going to be problematic in a few months because something in their life is going to adjust itself. You know, we see this when teenagers start in the UK, when they start high school, or they move from primary school to high school. That's a really, really big transition. And the beginning, the first year perhaps of high school is really, really difficult. But what's happening is from their perspective in their life, they're having a normal reaction to an abnormal situation in their views. You know, their whole social group has changed and their whole new environment. There's a load more responsibility with moving to high school. There's loads of stuff going on for them. So that's part of normal teenage development. So that can be quite hard to unpick as well. What else? If this was in the real world, then breaking and entering, it's not really a thing in the UK. That'd be more like burglary. And stealing would probably be classed as problematic. She might not see it as problematic, but everyone else around her probably would. People working with her probably would. And that's an interesting point, is that you can sometimes get this clash between what the child or adolescent sees as problematic and what adults in their life see as problematic. They might not see this, they might not see it the same way. So you got to keep that in mind as well. What else have we got? I think we're going to have more to come. I think we're going to see way more in this in this part of the framework as time goes on, as the episodes go on. So let's park this for now. Let's park presenting problems for now. This now moves us into another P. So let's go for precipitating. Oh my gosh, my spelling is so terrible. Precipitating factors. I see my handwriting is getting worse and worse as this video goes on. So these are what events, so events that can be internal or external, trigger the current problems. So what leads in the now to these? What comes up? What happens that leads her to experience all this? I think that makes sense. So seeing more violence. Like when she's out with her friends and they're all getting attacked. And not only seeing more violence, but how that leads to how she sees the safety of the world and the safety of others. Does that then start to activate this sense of self? Does it activate stuff from her past, the predisposing factors of how she sees the world and the safety and her place in it? Now, does that bring up memories of what happened with her mum, and have those memories been processed? We don't know yet either way. We didn't see much in terms of PTSD type symptoms, so we're not sure if there's any intrusive stuff there that hasn't been processed. But we're not sure. Maybe more will come out later on. It can take a while for symptoms to actually manifest. What else have we got in terms of precipitating factors? We know there's seeing more violence, but we also know there's a trigger about this idea of not being good enough. Because we see that when she overhears the conversation between Vi and the other chap, I can't remember his name now, and she doesn't even finish listening to the conversation. She runs away from it because it's so painful for her to listen to. So again, this activates how she sees the world and others, and that activates her sense of self. What else happened in episode 1 that triggered a presenting problem? I'm not sure. I can't think of anything right now. We can add, obviously, write in the comments anything more. We can also consider here potential precipitating factors. So potential triggers, if we want to use more common language here. Potential triggers. So what potential triggers are there? Well, there's seeing more death. How will she react to that? What else do we have? We have potentially more rejection. How will she react to that? What would happen if Vi and Evander left? How would she cope? That safe base would be gone. Would she stay in the pub? I doubt it, because Vander runs the pub, so that would probably just turn into absolute chaos in there. Not only is there rejection, but actually there's more abandonment. How would she react to this? What if these things happened? What would her presentation be in the now? It would certainly, these things, rejection and abandonment, would certainly smash her sense of self. It would certainly reinforce she's small, she gets in the way, she screws up, she's a liability. Because she would see herself as not being good enough. Would it lead to more crime, breaking, entering, stealing? Possibly not, because I think she probably does that with her friends. I don't think she would do it by herself, maybe out of necessity. I'm not sure. Yeah, so lots of things to consider there. And then we have the other P, which is perpetuating factors. So perpetuating factors are what keeps the presenting problem going. What are the maintenance factors? Usually in therapy, these are called like safety behaviors. They actually reinforce the problem. They don't actually help get rid of the problem. And these could be things in the external environment and relationships, and it could also be things internal in terms of thoughts, feelings, emotions, how you see yourself. So we have the presenting problem is the actual problem. The precipitating factor is the trigger for the problem presenting itself. And then the perpetuating factor is what keeps the problem going once it's been triggered. Why doesn't it just get triggered and then stop? Why does it keep going? So we've got lives in a bar. So we talked about this as a protective factor, but I think it can also be a perpetuating factor. We don't know what she's exposed to there. There might be drug taking, there might be drinking going on. That could all be being really normalized for her. She might be seeing more fights and violence. We don't know. I haven't seen much of that bar. They all seem quite protective of Vander in that scene, and I wonder if by association they would then be protective of Vi and Powder. But what does that protection look like? What's she been exposed to? We don't know. So she lives in a bar. She's got a peer group. Now, again, the peer group could be somewhat protective, but it can also be somewhat problematic. I see this all the time in my daily practice where children tend to get in trouble in groups of peers, but those groups of peers are also ones they turn to when they need something. And if you were just to pick up one child out of that group and separate them, but not give them anything to replace that with, they don't deal with that very well. They don't deal with being removed from the group because they've got no one else then. They've got no sense of belonging to anything else. That's really difficult for them. There's probably here, I think, something around the anxiety of loss happening again. So this idea that loss has happened in the past with her mum, could it happen again? And the underlying, am I going to lose everything? Are people I trust going to go away? Is there going to be another war? Are other people going to die? And actually, it's not just the anxiety of loss happening again. There's anxiety of rejection and abandonment. This is what a lot of children in care experience. So potential triggers are more death, rejection, and abandonment if they actually happen. But there's also perpetuating that, the anxiety of it happening again. That's why we see children sometimes sabotaging placements when they're in care, because they're so used to being moved around. They don't even unpack a plastic bag or bin liner anymore with all their stuff in it. They leave it packed. And the longer they're in a placement, their anxiety builds and builds and builds, because they're just, it's going to break down soon, it's going to break down soon, it's going to break down soon, I'm going to be rejected. And that anxiety gets to a point where it's just overwhelming. So in order to reduce that anxiety, they do something that breaks the placement down. The placement goes, you're going to have to go now. Sorry, you're too risky. And it's like, oh, phew, now I'm going to go. Although it's really hard for them to go, it reduces anxiety in the short term of waiting to be told that they're going to go. Other perpetuating factors with her peer group? Oh, actually, there's what they say about her. So some of them just say that she gets in the way and she's a liability. That's likely to reinforce this and keeps it going. So how she fits in with the group. What else maintains this? What's her emotional regulation like? There was a fight or flight response during the fight scene. That seemed quite appropriate. She seemed to be able to look after herself there. However, getting in the fights themselves and the actual environment of the fact that that might happen to her again is probably a perpetuating factor. So I think we're there, actually. So we've got the 5 Ps. We've got perpetuating, precipitating, presenting, protective. These ones all fit nicely together, look. And then we've got up here predisposing, where we talked about PTSD and developmental trauma, deprivation of appropriate age opportunities, parental separation, poverty and oppression, and the exposure to trauma, as I've just said. So those are early life experiences that lead to vulnerabilities. We then have presenting problems. So what's actually going on for the person right now that's problematic. Precipitating factors, what triggers those presenting problems. Perpetuating factors are what maintains those problems once they've started and keeps them from happening. And keeps them happening, not from happening, keeps them going. And then we've got the protective factors, which you hope keep someone safe and can help to reduce the presenting problems and help to reduce the precipitating problems and hope to reduce the perpetuating factors. So I think this is pretty good for an initial impression. I think what will be interesting is seeing how all of this develops, seeing how those predisposing factors, precipitating factors and perpetuating factors all lead into and explain presenting problems as they arise throughout the episodes, and whether these protective factors are going to be enough to help. I think we're there. I'm not going to do this after every episode, maybe after every arc, then we can revisit this and we can add info into these points and we can see how this develops. I might draw it up so it's a bit nicer than this. This is quite messy. But I think this was fun. Maybe this gives you some insight into how we kind of conceptualize some people's problems. I can't do this with music artists because it doesn't feel right doing it with real people in the real world, especially when they don't have a say or any input into what goes into this. But I'm loving this so far. Look at this. Just for one character. If you want to see this for another character as time goes on, then please let me know. I think this was really fun. Thanks for watching, everyone. Take care. Goodbye.